I must emphasize from the first that this lecture is entirely extramural. It is not part of your regular curriculum, and you will gain nothing by quoting from it in your examinations. Nevertheless, since you have expressed a special interest in the astronomical phenomenon variously known as the Star of Ecbaton, the Star of Jerusalem, the Star of Herod, and, I regret to say, the Star of Balthazaar, which attracted widespread notice some 12 years ago, I feel compelled to describe my observations of it. Where truth is not asserted strongly, rumour and error take its place, begetting fable, myth, fiction, and ultimately superstition. It is therefore my duty to narrate and explain truthfully my actions during this time when this star, as it is called, though this is a technical misnomer, star I shall call it, in deference to what has already become tradition, was visible to the inhabitants of this globe. I have expressed regret that in certain quarters the star has become associated with my name. Yet that was what I originally wished. I was head of science at the Western Court of King Phraates IV of Persia, at Ecbaton. As such, I observed the heavens at night from the roof garden of the palace, where a glass dome sheltered my instruments. For most men, day is the time for work, night the time for rest. For an astronomer, the opposite is very often the case. In palaces, duty, ritual, and rest, and fun have no fixed origin or end. Rather, as in other edifices with which you as students are doubtless familiar, the border between day and night is blurred. An astronomer is halfway to success if he can keep his brain less blurred than that border. Every evening everyone danced, except Casper and certain other Stoics who condemned dancing as decadent. At first I felt inclined to agree, but my standing at court required attendance, and I came to feel that capering like monkeys was no worse than hissing like snakes. Besides, I found that dancing, in moderation, sharpens the senses and tones the mind. So, while others fuddled their heads, I cleared mine, dancing to shake from lungs and brain the dust that day had piled in them, so that in darkness I could see mentally what brightness obscures for so many. When others went to bed with heads humming, I went to work. At times so keen I fancied I could hear the music echo through space, though I knew, of course, as well then as now that this is impossible. I did not dance for excitement or show, but it was pleasant to be told I danced well, as, you will be amazed to hear, happened. I was praised by Risha, daughter of the provincial governor. Though this was less impressive than it sounds, there were swift promotions at the courts of Phraates. The king believed in advancing men to the height of their abilities, with the result that many went beyond and became liabilities. One night, Risha smiled at me so sweetly that, fearing to become the fool of love, I scuttled up the stairs to the roof garden, where my folly took a different turn. I noticed a star in the eastern sky, very bright for its low position, certainly not the evening star. For 2 nights I tracked its orbit. Faster than Jupiter, slower than Mars, 1/5 increase in relative brightness. Planet or comet? There were strong arguments against both. Why the brightening? Was it growing in incandescence or approaching the Earth? On the 3rd night, the dancing seemed interminable. I was impatient to go to my phenomenon, confident she would be waiting at the spot I had trysted for her in the heavens. The circles of the dance were nothing to me compared to that orbit. These people, what did they know of the stars? To them, the ceiling was the night sky. Sailors, farmers look up but do not learn. The stars point to some port or tell the seasons. Astrologers do not study stars as stars, only as signs. They think some god is scribbling on the blackboard, a god of bad handwriting. They have to work so hard to make it out. Indeed, they hardly ever look at the stars, but just work out their would-bes from ancient texts. But even they, book-bound as they were, could hardly fail to notice this for long. Would another claim discovery of what I considered my personal star? There must be no delay. Someone must share the secret, be my witness. I grabbed Richa by the arm and whisked her through the crowd. In some courts, such an act might have ended a career. A man in the midst of 1,000 eyes, dashing with a girl of noble birth upstairs to a room no other man entered. Even in the tolerant atmosphere of Ecbaton there were tongues and blushes. But I did not care. I had a jewel to show my beloved, greater than any in the Queen's tiara. How she would gasp as we entered the moonlit dome. How strange, weird, even sinister to her would appear the implements of science. Astrolabes, gyroscopes, protractors, books babbling a tongue she did not know called mathematics, anatomical sketches, faintly obscene perhaps on first glance. But as a man might buy a necklace for his wife and leave it for her to find in her knitting, so I would let her find the star, casually, indicate the sextant I had angled to isolate it in the sky, wait, not invite her, for her to peep through the stars, listen to her delighted gasp and the words, "What a beautiful star." She said it as soon as we reached the roof garden. The star was almost a magnitude brighter, and the slightest glance was enough to show that it was 5 minutes west by 3 north of the position I had calculated. 5 minutes west, 3 north. This star was not merely an aberration, it was mad. I knew much about stellar angles. There was another class of angles of which I was ignorant, the angles to which the human ear could be bent. I had no notion of sparking a crisis. I thought the Times had turned pragmatical. So much so that Balthazaar, courtier, had to exert all his skill to save Balthazaar, scientist, from the charge of being not a sorcerer but a moonstruck dreamer. Although I was in name a Zoroastrian, religion interested me little, even psychologically. I had forgotten the legends of my childhood. I did not realize how many had not. When told the king was coming to court and that I was to speak on the star in his presence, I was naturally delighted. Pure investigative science was being properly recognized at last. The king sat on his throne. Beside him, his Roman wife Musa, and their son, the crown prince, the golden apple of every eye. His Majesty congratulated me on my discovery. a compliment I could pass off with unfeigned modesty, as the star was there for all to see. I had merely computed its orbit, and that I had got wrong. Nevertheless, I would endeavour to reduce its movements to simple, elegant formulae that even kings might take pleasure in. I'd better not say understand. The king praised me again, then said, "Now we would know what this event signifies for us." For us? For one moment I thought he meant to annex the star, or order the building of a ladder to snatch it down, to put in a goldfish bowl, or swallow it for some good royal reason. Not that I had ever seen symptoms in him of mania, but prudence demands perpetual caution before the powerful. I resorted to the courtier's trick of bowing my head, as if deferentially framing a reply, so hiding my eyes and flicking them left and right, trying to read some hint in other eyes what the king meant. I saw Caspar open his mouth. To know Caspar was to guess what he would say, for he was a man with one thing on his mind. That was my clue to the king's question, what does it signify for us? But then Caspar, instead of speaking, drew his lips into a steely grin, and I heard the voice of Melchior instead. "Your Majesties, the heavens would never blaze so gorgeously if they did not augur good. Just what good, I am not competent to say. I leave that to the higher wisdom of others. It cannot be a prediction of peace, for that we enjoy in amplitude already. Indeed there is, thank Ormazd and your Majesties, so little likelihood of war that it cannot be taken as an omen of triumph. And who needs an omen when victory would be certain? A bounteous harvest, perhaps, the discovery of rich veins of gold, the invention of new medicines, or some fortune as yet unconceived of by man, yet still more conducive to his well-being." I could tell he was dying to predict the birth of a future king. But how could he, with the heir to the throne standing in youthful arrogance before him? But it would have tarnished his tact to hint that the world contained other monarchs to whom the birth of heirs might be presaged. So he just stood there, grinning his famous grin, which, it was said, could curve right round his face and meet in the back of his neck, so nauseating the whole court at once. But then Caspar, having let Melchior emit so many wooden words to provide him with a platform, spoke. "Your Majesties, the truth is even better than Melchior thinks. This star foretells the coming of the Redeemer promised by Zoroaster to drag our corrupt age up to judgment. He will sweep through our days, exalting the lowly with the lever of time, winnow our human dust for the true gold, plant the seed and plough down the mighty. Let us therefore abase ourselves, for those who stand upright in their pride shall fall to his scythe, but those who kneel shall feel it shear away their load of sorrow." The king turned to me. He said, "And what is your opinion?" I told him my opinion. The star was a manifestation of unconscious nature, purposeless, a sensory event produced by vibrations following laws, puzzling but in principle deducible. Unique both in brightness and behaviour, it must be studied, for what is man but the will to know? our understanding of its processes might lead to material benefits. Taking a negative view, the star, through forces not yet understood, might cause some catastrophe, which studying it could not avert, at least assuage. Famine or plague? Unlikely. Earthquake? Flood? Possibly. That it might strike the earth, might indeed be larger than the earth, was a thought I deemed it wise to conceal. I glanced at Caspar and Melchior. For once in their lives, the expressions on their faces were the same. I was glad to see that I had offended both. The king seemed to favour my view, but he had his worries, which all understood, though few dared mention. He had ruled well, but had gained his crown by murder. If the star was the harbinger of justice, raising the dead to accuse the living, he had cause for fear. The Queen laid a comforting arm on his shoulder and asked me what would I personally do about this star. I said I did not know how long the star would be visible from Persia, or indeed from anywhere in the known world. For my part, I wished to study it, to try to learn a little of why it was so different from other stars. It was touching to see the king's wife and son display their devotion. Next morning, the king announced, "Some say the star betokens good, some ill, some that it is merely a flash of nature. Whatever the truth, it must not depart unknown. I therefore decree the sending of a mission headed by Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazaar, to observe and interpret, and to be our embassage to any foreign kings over whose territories the star may pass." My joy! A scientific expedition, perhaps the first since the heyday of the Greeks, and I to be its leader. Oh, true, nominally the journey had other purposes, diplomatic, religious, if you will, apocalyptic. But I saw it foremost as a triumph for science, a chance to banish superstition. True, also, I would have to leave Risha. I would have to tolerate Caspar and Melchior, and others of like mind, if mind is the term for linear rigidity of thought. But that was a small price for knowledge. Remote the star may be, unreachable, but every scrap of knowledge is a cornerstone of being human. Hermit on the rock, who sees one moss spread quicker than another, or counts the rhythm of a bird's wing beat, you have conquered more than many kings. Decision was reached. The star was drifting westward. We would travel westward on its trail. Melchior to honey-tongue any petty foreign potentate, thinking this was his greeting card from the gods. Caspar, I suppose, because he did not wish to miss any misery it might illuminate. I, because it was my star. Whom else would they name it after? And if it moved at unprecedented speed, so must I as scientist. Besides, the star's effect on ignorant minds was also scientifically important. We departed in state. It annoys me when people say it must have been a hard, lonely journey. 3 men with 1 camel, sweating and shivering across mountain passes and trackless wastes. As if a king would send the flower of his court abroad in such a manner. We followed the main trade route, with rich gifts to bestow if the star meant well. or to buy our way out of trouble if it did not. Melchior and his friends wallowed in luxury. Caspar and company criticised their excesses, while dipping the odd toe in these dirty waters and enjoying themselves with enviable gusto. And I brooked no delay in keeping our angular progress equal to the stars. We were well in line with it on our last night in Persia before crossing into the chain of states allied to Rome. We stayed at a fine inn, well stocked. We drank farewell to our country. Some drank such a deep farewell it was unnecessary. Next day they couldn't travel. We met a Jewish merchant there, I remember, and Melchior, adept at flattering every race, suggested the star might signal Israel's dominance. The Jew thought for a moment, then shrugged. My people's history is disappointment. I pin no hopes on any star in heaven. But isn't there a prophecy that Israel will not be least among the nations? When we are not least, we will be no nation. Jewish kings sought empire, but their people never followed their wishes, sometimes choosing slavery over mastery. But surely your scriptures predict a Saviour. If this is he, the world had better watch out. None more than us Jews. I said perhaps a world wiser and wealthier than ours had burst into flames to make that star. If we fail to study the laws of nature, that fate may well be ours. Caspar latched to the morbid side of such speculations. He said a world might well be better than ours and still merit destruction. He seemed to see the cosmos as an infinite scale of worlds, each in its wickedness somehow igniting itself to blaze as a beacon of warning to the next. Since he cherished small hope of any world mending its ways, this endless immolation seemed astonishingly futile. Melchior said in that case, to reform our world by virtuous living would be to shirk our duty, as we would never burn as a warning to anyone else. He was a flattering, fawning fool. But sometimes his fat finger fell of its own weight on the nub of a problem. He maintained, with a good spadeful of argument, that the gods would not destroy a world for nothing. They knew that we would see this star, what we would do as a result, and what we did would be what the star foretold, whether or not we were wise enough to read the signs correctly. Of course, this implied assumptions about providence that I could not make. If gods there were, they might have lit that star to warm their hands, and what we made of it mattered to them no more than the squirming of maggots in burning logs does to us. Those of us who are not scientists. None of us had seen Jerusalem. We knew it had been ruined in Pompey's war. We knew Judea was a poor country, or so our Jewish friends' ethnic self-deprecation led us to believe. When we saw towers poke over the horizon, we thought our maps must be in error, and this another city, which we felt impelled to visit, though the star was south of it. We found a palace and temple fit to stand comparison with any in the world. But King Herod could easily afford to build them, being spared the cost of an army, for both were guarded chiefly by Roman troops. The character of Herod was no secret. Caspar, you may guess, insisted the signs meant that men like Herod would crush this evil world. In serving base ambitions, they served God. They were Ahura Mazda's deterrent to purge the earth of its filth. Melchior said in that case there was nothing to be lost by a little politeness. He would kneel on the devil's coals, that one. Herod's red tape unravelled smoothly, though not without some kinks that threatened to knot around us if the need arose. Soon our brows were striking the mosaic before his throne, gifts discreetly arrayed before us. Sire, our congratulations.
What for?
Well, we aren't quite sure, Your Majesty, but we think the bright star dangling almost above your palace augurs well for you, possibly an addition to your family, a newborn king of Israel. However, none of Herod's wives or concubines turned out to be in a condition to fulfill such a prophecy, which I may say, considering his Judaic Majesty's age and appearance, did not excite our wonder. Well, in that case, we apologize to Your Majesty. We would be grateful for some clue as to the significance of this unusual astral thing. Herod's wise men scanned their sacred scrolls and said if any special birth should happen, it should be in Bethlehem, some miles southward, and the star lay in that quarter. So we took the road to Bethlehem, Caspar, Melchior, and I. The rest chose to remain at Herod's court. A cynic like Caspar might have been unkind enough to suggest that they had lost interest in heavenly realms and human destiny in favour of soft couches, warmth, wine, music, perfumes, gaming and sex. And a cynic like Caspar might have been right. So we three, the extremists of the party, travelled to Bethlehem, accompanied by Herod's own hand-picked escorts, with whom our acquaintance was brief. For no one had thought to inform us that Bethlehem was a registration centre for the census then being held throughout the Roman Empire. Everyone in Palestine was there. Within an hour we had lost our guides in the crowd. Within two there was nothing on our minds but our buffeted bodies and where to rest them. We tramped from inn to inn. Everywhere we got the same reply. Full up for the night. No vacancies. What's that? Important invoice from the King of Persia, are you? Oh, yes, every man is important in his own eyes, but every man takes up space. 33 we've got here now in rooms built to hold 10, and every one of them thinks his night's sleep worth more than 1,000 Persian envoys. At last we found a landlord more resourceful. No beds, gents, but you can sleep in the shed. Hope that's not too rough. Knock gently before you go in. There's a couple in there with a new baby. One or two friends called to congratulate them. I don't know if they mean to spend the night. If they do, well, there should still be room enough to curl up in the corners. So Melchior knocked on the stable door. Gently, or perhaps just feebly. While we waited, Caspar said, in the harshest tones I ever heard, even from him, I suppose you know that star of yours is directly overhead. We stood some moments, cursing the star in our hearts. The door opened, emitting a stink of dung, and a face such as I hope never again to see in my life, a sullen, swarthy, cracked rag of a face that clouds had spat in. I felt ashamed to see by the same light. Be quiet! Woman in here just had a baby! We know that, the landlord said. We're full up! There's 3 of us here, as well as the lady and her husband and the cattle. At these words I was for going home, abandoning Bethlehem, star and science, sleeping out in the open, risking robbers and wild beasts. At least they were few in a wilderness, not multitudes in a city, where every man and every animal is every other's enemy in the battle for space. Even Melchior's customary greasiness congealed a little. Nevertheless, he dangled gold at the ruffian, who scowled, seemed to hate us for having gold to offer, swore, as far as I could understand him. I hope so. I'd hate to think such noises could mean anything else. But then a gentle voice within said, "I would like to see the visitors." He shrugged and opened the door with reluctance, mirrored by us as we entered. There were cattle there, but that did not bother me. It seemed a welcome paradox that anything in Bethlehem could be in the right place. I was more concerned about the three peasants. I felt I would rather sleep in a leaky boat on a shark-filled ocean than in such company. But the girl lying on the pallet, the grey-haired man by her side, had the boat been sound, they could have had it, though I must bed down with the sharks. But where, I thought, is this baby? There's none in her arms or his. And why are these herdsmen slumped around that feeding trough? Why do they gaze dewy-eyed into it when they're not glowering suspiciously at us? Are they afraid we mean to snaffle their fodder? Curiosity led me, what I thought the risk of my life, from sheep fever if not from violence, to sidle over and observe that the baby had been dumped in the feeding trough. For a moment I thought it was stillborn and they were using it as cattle feed. Then it opened its eyes. You doubtless know that many lesser mammals have closed eyes till some weeks after birth, while others are born not just with open eyes, but a high degree of control over their limbs. Our species alone seems to be born with eyes usable but helpless bodies. A strange coincidence of powerlessness and power to beg for power, and also the promise and threat of power in years to come, when bodies now strong will shrivel. I felt compromised, standing so close, and drew back. 3 shepherds hunched around a manger, far more engrossed in its contents than the grey-haired man supposed to be its father. One might have thought they had begotten the child, not he, or at least that it had been born for their especial benefit. Why theirs? Because they were poor, and therefore resented the intrusion of a set of wealthy men? He belongs to us poor outcasts. First thing you know, that rich superior lot come by to claim him. The mother read their thoughts and said, "Suppose one of your ewes had lambed, and the rams would not let you near the youngling, saying it was born for sheep and not for shepherds. Would you not say that the lamb of sheep is lamb for shepherds even more? For sheep need merely graze, but men need wool and meat." I thought, shepherds kill the lamb for food, unhindered by the flock. And this child lies here as if to be eaten by animals. May he fare better among men. Then Melchior said, "Here's a hansel," and placed some gold in the manger. I had some herbs and put those in too. Why should we give such presents, brought for princes, to a labourer's son in a stable? We had been guided to him by the star. Was that enough? I stepped out and looked up. The star was still there, but fainter. As I watched, it faded out. From that moment, I have never seen such a sight again. So there was no point in searching further. Our rich gifts, whom were they for if not this child? This time, at least, I did not have to quarrel with Caspar and Melchior. I sensed they were thinking the same thing. The infant yawned his gratitude and slept, which we took as permission to do likewise. I remember waking shortly before dawn and hearing the parents whispering together. I had no wish to eavesdrop. I returned to my dream. I promised I would truthfully narrate my actions. Dreams are not actions, and I would rather omit them, except that certain actions of my own may become clearer if I tell you this dream and risk any ridiculous interpretations that may be placed on it. I dreamed that the star had a face, and this face was the face of everybody I loved. My family, my friends, Risha, the child, its parents, even Caspar and Melchior. And this star face shone on a foul stream, a stream that also had a face flowing yet fixed like a whirlpool, a face smiling, yet with its forelip curled and hard like a vulture's beak. I tremble now to think of it, but it did not scare me then. I knew that it desired to swallow the star and all of us with it. But I was not afraid. I even felt glad that it was happy in the belief that it could do so. Sunlight peeped through the rafters. I opened my eyes and met those of Melchior. Pleasant dreams, he purred. I smiled, sure that his dreams had been similar to mine. Soon we were all awake, beaming at each other. All except Melchior. He did his best, but it was a twisted effort. It struck me, that should be Caspar, not Melchior. All except Caspar. He did his best, but it was a twisted effort. It struck me it was the first time he had smiled without sneering, and his mouth muscles couldn't manage it. The time came to part, the shepherds to tend their flocks, and we to tell our people we had seen a pauper child in a feeding hopper. I felt we had so much to tell about how vain were the chief concerns of mankind, how what we call the little things are very often the great things, as a point of light may be a world larger than our own. I saw it in my way. No doubt Caspar and Melchior saw it in their ways, and the shepherds in theirs. That boy will now be 12 years old. I do not know his name. Yet I confess to a strange assurance that before I die, I shall hear of him and know that it is he. We paid our landlord as much for his shed as he could have made from his best suite of rooms. Then Melchior said, "Well, shall we seek our guides, or make our own way back to Herod's court?" Caspar fell forward and wept. "Return to Herod if you love death," he wailed. "I was right. The star foretold destruction." We stared at this man who had shared the sights that we had, thinking his long brooding on dreadful things had unhinged him. But he too had dreamed, though not as blissfully as we. For him the star had worn one face, the face of Herod. For him its rays were knives, and each had found a baby in its cot. You have heard of the slaughter of infants in Israel. Some of you have not believed it, dismissed it as myth. How could any king find men to obey such a mad order? Blame us, if you will, for seeking a palace instead of a stable. Melchior and I thought his dream exaggerated, that we were in danger, not every boy-child in Bethlehem. Otherwise we might have tried to save them, and possibly perished ourselves. But what could better confirm that we had seen a prince? For could any tyrant carry out a massacre of babies, unless sure that one of them was his predestined foe? And you may wonder why I am so sure that I shall hear of that boy again. Grant me one secret and some faith. Return to Jerusalem was out. We could expect no help against Herod from our friends if we came to interrupt their banquets with tales of gods in straw. We three would have to travel home alone. Our first step was to buy new clothes, or rather old ones, partly for disguise against Herod's men, partly because finery might tempt robbers. Then we set out along unfrequented roads, a hard, lonely journey. 3 men with not one camel, sweating and shivering across mountain passes and trackless wastes. At length we reached the inn where we had spent our last night in Persia. But it was no longer the bustling place it had been. It was lonely, almost deserted. A sullen woman who seemed to resent this break in her daily vegetating let us in. Said at this season she kept few victuals, since a court delegation descended and ate her out of house and home. And it's harder than ever to buy in supplies now, since you know what. We did not know what, but we said we would take what she gave and be grateful. As, truth to tell, we were. We were on home soil once more. We had a message for our king and nation. What was that message? I find it hard now to word it, but it implied tolerance even of nasty hostesses. Yes, we were content, footsore, weary, yet at peace with the world until our meal was brought. Some of you have seen me in the refectory refuse to complain of slow service or poor cooking. Let us be thankful for what we receive and bless the humble slave who brings it. But when the humble slave has one eye, and that eye widens in recognition. Melchior caught the tray before it fell. I had long despised his crawling courtesy, the oiliness he oozed over the world. But perhaps he was the wisest of us 3. Melchior caught the tray before it fell and said, "Won't you sit and join us?" And Risha sat. Queen Musa, whose devotion to King Phraates had made her name famous throughout all Persia for wifely love, had murdered him. Those of his courtiers who had stayed at home instead of following stars were jailed or dead. Risha herself had protested strongly enough to have her eye poked out by the Queen's own sceptre. And so, you who seek wisdom in the stars, behold the wondrous influence of this one. It gave Queen Musa the perfect excuse to send her husband's counsellors away to where they could not hinder her plans. Caspar went back to Jerusalem. He said King Herod could not last much longer, and rightly as it turned out. And interesting things might happen there if a man waited long enough. He is, as far as I know, still waiting. Melchior went on into Persia, into the jaws of death for any man in the late king's favour. Perhaps his silky tongue was smooth enough to slide him out. I do not know. So now, students of Alexandria, you know how you got your odd lecturer with the one-eyed wife. The Balthazaar, the one they named the star after. Let me re-emphasize that this lecture is entirely extramural. It is not part of your regular curriculum, and you will gain nothing by quoting from it in your examinations.
Got it.